Thank you, Ruben and Alika, for coordinating this meeting and inviting me. I really appreciate it. So the title of my talk is Environmental Health Registries, Case Studies from ATSDR. ATSDR is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. So by way of disclosures, I have no conflicts to report. This other statement on this slide just says that I'm speaking from my own personal experience, and what I'm saying may not perfectly reflect policy at my agency. So ATSDR is a small federal agency located within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We're headquartered in Atlanta. We're actually a sister agency of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and we're responsible for environmental health-related issues, especially those related to toxic substances. So we do a lot of emergency response, especially as related to acute releases of substances into the environment. We also publish reports known as tox profiles, which are just summary reports of the toxicity of specific chemicals. We do public health assessments at specific sites across the country, and we also do public health surveillance and conduct registries. So today, I'll be talking about public health registries, and to start, I'll just be providing a definition and talk a little bit about the design and considerations for establishing a registry. Then I'll move on to 3 case studies of registries either run in the past or currently being run by ATSDR, the National ALS Registry, the National Exposure Registry, and finally the Tremolite Asbestos Registry. In terms of background for registries, a registry is simply a set of records containing systematically collected standardized data about individuals. Registries are typically acquired, maintained, and updated over a very long period, usually years. Registries can provide information when health consequences of environmental exposures are uncertain or will take a long time to develop. Registries can also aid research on diseases that may have environmental causes that are not well defined yet. And so these last 2 bullets actually they actually define disease and exposure registries. A disease registry collects information on people with a particular disease or health outcome, or a risk factor that predisposes them to illness, such as a genetic factor. An exposure registry collects information on people with previous exposure to substances or circumstances known or suspected to cause adverse health effects. This slide compares the timelines of disease and exposure registries. In the top figure are an illustration of the time course for a disease registry. So it begins with a disease diagnosis. A person is diagnosed with a specific disease. They're then enrolled in a registry. And then the registry is used to look back at common exposures by people in the registry to see if there's a cause or a common risk factor for people with that disease. The bottom figure is for an exposure registry. With an exposure registry, there's a common exposure of interest that people have. They're then enrolled in the registry, and then the registry is used to look prospectively to see if people develop disease. I think you'll see over the rest of this meeting that no 2 public health events are alike, and the approach used to stand up a registry can vary quite a bit as well. But here are some considerations that any registry should undertake before establishing a registry. First is the public health significance of the event. Not all events warrant a registry, while some scream to have a registry created. And an example of a public health situation that resulted in a registry was the atomic bomb detonation in World War II in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Of course, atomic bombs had never been detonated before, and the long-term health of survivors was unknown at that point, so that situation clearly called for the creation of a registry. Next is the registry purpose and expected outcomes. It's very important to determine what the purpose and the intent of a registry is, and with that information, the purpose will guide all subsequent decisions about how the data are collected and what the timeline or time course of data collection will be. Next is the duration and scope of data collection. Will the registry be collecting data over a short, discrete time period or over many years? Are other data sources available? If they are, then perhaps a registry is not needed, or perhaps those other data sources could be leveraged to do a targeted health study to answer the question or meet the proposed registry's purpose or intent. Next is the timeliness of registry creation. Will the registry be created shortly after a public health event occurs, or will there be a long gap between the event and when the registry is stood up? And then finally, the final consideration is the availability of funds and scientific capacity. So a proposed registry may check off all the other boxes, but if funds are not available to create the registry, then it seems unlikely that a registry would actually be created. So the first case study I'll be presenting is ATSDR's National Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, or ALS registry. It's a disease registry. ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. I'll just continue reading off the slide deck in front of me. 90% of ALS cases are thought to have an environmental risk factor, and that's what caused this registry to come to ATSDR in the first place. ALS is basically untreatable. There are FDA-approved drugs, but they're very expensive, and they only extend life by 2 to 3 months on average. So the National ALS Registry was authorized by Congress in the U.S. ALS Registry Act. So the purpose of the ALS registry is to identify cases, report epidemiologic measures of ALS for the entire country, and to identify demographics of ALS patients. This slide shows selected registry products and demonstrate return on investment in the program. So the first one is of course, ALS epidemiologic measures for the entire country, prevalence, incidence, and mortality. These measures were unavailable prior to when the registry was stood up in 2010. The registry also funds extramural research on ALS etiology and via an R01 grant mechanism. And to date, 28 studies have been funded under the program. 70 institutions have used registry data for clinical trials and health studies, with more than 5,000 patients recruited for clinical trials. The next case study I'd like to point out is the National Exposure Registry, or NER. In 1983, ATSDR was delegated the authority to establish registries for health follow-up of populations with residential exposure to toxic hazards. NER's primary goal was to fill data gaps for long-term health effects, defined as persistent health outcomes lasting more than 1 year. Aims of the program were to facilitate health studies, facilitate health surveillance programs by identifying and tracking registrants, and to provide information to assess the burden of the health effects of exposure or health outcome on a population. 4 sub-registries were created beginning in 1989. 3 were solvents in drinking water for benzene, trichloroethane, and trichloroethylene. The 4th sub-registry was for dioxins in soils. The way that NER operated was a baseline survey was administered that included respondent demographics and health outcomes, such as anemia, skin rashes, and cancer. A follow-up survey was subsequently administered every 3 years and asked for health outcome updates. Self-reported health outcomes were were compared with a national sample, that is the National Health Interview Survey. Exposure was typically defined using one-time environmental measurements made in some cases years before the registry was established. And that'll have an impact on the program that I'll point out in just a moment. This slide shows a hierarchy of exposure data or surrogates of exposure data, ranked from best to poorest. The best metric for exposure is quantifiable personal measurements. Think of a personal dosimeter attached to a person that collected information on an ongoing basis. Regarding the intensity and duration of exposure. And the worst were the seventh one, which was residence or employment in a defined geographic area, that is a county of the site. And the ideal, of course, would be to use quantifiable personal measurements, but for many exposures, the technology doesn't exist, and we don't live in an ideal world either. So usually in both health studies and in registries, we're forced to settle for a less than optimal metric for exposure. And I think in the case of the National Exposure Registry, it actually fell under the sixth category, residence or employment in a geographic area in reasonable proximity to the site where the exposure can be assumed. So in conclusion for NER, the last follow-up data collection occurred in 2000. Due to the inability to adequately assess exposure, the registry was terminated in 2004. Typically, registries go on for many years, as did NER. It's a long-term commitment by the funding agency, but sometimes the decision has to be made that the registry is no longer meeting its original intent, and therefore NER was terminated. Some lessons learned from NER include, it's no problem. Lessons learned include, when considering an exposure registry, the quality of data used to define exposure should be carefully evaluated. And the second lesson learned is self-reported health outcomes should be confirmed by verifying medical records and using objective clinical measurements where possible. So the third and last case study is the Tremlite Asbestos Registry. This is an exposure registry for people exposed to asbestos in Libby, Montana. Libby is a small, geographically isolated city in the extreme northwest corner of the state. It's near the Canadian border. Very beautiful and picturesque part of the country. Its population is about 10,000 with about 4,000 homes and businesses. The city is notorious for being the former site of the most productive vermiculite mine worldwide. Vermiculite is a mica-like mineral that has the density similar to popcorn after it's heated. In the photograph in the upper right-hand corner, in that person's right hand, are pieces of vermiculite as they come out of the ground. They're small and very dense. In the center photo is vermiculite after it has been expanded. And again, it has the density similar to popcorn or styrofoam after it's heated. It's used commercially as insulation, fireproof coatings, and a soil additive. Vermiculite mining at scale began in Libby in the 1930s. But unfortunately, here's the kicker, Libby vermiculite contains asbestos, which of course we know is a toxic substance and carcinogen that primarily affects the lungs. Unfortunately, the community was unaware of the hazards of exposure to vermiculite while the mine was being operated. And again, it operated for roughly 60 years in the middle of the 20th century. In addition to documented occupational exposure, there were numerous community exposure pathways. For example, the running track at the high school was covered with vermiculite. And there was one baseball field in the town also covered with vermiculite. The company that operated the mine, it was a very dusty operation, and a large proportion of the dust was asbestos, and the company used to refer to the dust as a nuisance dust. So I think the community took the lead of the company and basically was unaware for many years that they were being exposed every time they used vermiculite around their homes. The mine closed in 1990, and for a period it dropped off everyone's radar, but news reports of widespread illness and death appeared in 1999, which prompted investigation by the federal government. This slide shows diseases that are common after asbestos exposure. The first is asbestosis, which is a chronic progressive fibrosis of the gas exchange region of the lung. Next are pleural plaques, which are fibrosis of the tissue that lines the outer part of the lung. Plaques are considered a marker of asbestos exposure. Next is mesothelioma, which is a rare cancer of the tissues that line the chest, abdomen, and other body cavities. The majority of cases of mesothelioma are also associated with asbestos exposure. And you may have heard of mesothelioma. It's frequently advertised on TV by plaintiff law firms looking for cases of mesothelioma. And the fourth most common disease associated with asbestos is lung cancer. It's the same tumor caused by smoking cigarettes. Asbestos also causes lung cancer. ATSDR began its involvement in 1999 in Libby and began community-based screening there in 2000 and 2001. The screening consisted of a health survey, chest x-rays, and spirometry. It had a very active program trying to get residents to participate, and ultimately 7,307 persons did take part. From the chest x-rays that were taken, the prevalence of pleural plaque was 18%. So remember that pleural plaque is a marker of asbestos exposure. This statistic confirmed that many people in the community were exposed to asbestos sometime while the mine was operating. Additional screening was conducted in Libby during 2003 to 2008 and expanded to include follow-up screening. ATSDR then initiated the Tremlite Asbestos Registry in 2003. The TAR serves as a repository for the data collected during screening. And my apologies, it may be difficult to read this slide. It shows a table from a published study of a mortality study of people that took part in screening. And a couple things that I wanted to share with you and point out is that you probably can't see it, but the second column is exposure category, and there's 5 qualitative exposure categories used to stratify the results in the table. And I just wanted to point out that a well-done health survey with well-considered exposure questions allow this type of analysis. The other feature that I wanted to point out was the long-term follow-up underlying this study. There were 16 years of follow-up. And again, registries are done typically over a very long period of time and allow for looking at changes in the health of registrants over many years and sometimes decades. So screening in Libby is ongoing. ATSDR currently funds a program in Libby via a non-research grant under the Affordable Care Act. This program is now in its 14th year. The grant recipient is a small local nonprofit named the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease. It conducts long-term screening and specialty care. Under this program, participants diagnosed with asbestos-related disease become eligible for Medicare benefits regardless of their age. Over 5,700 people have been screened in this particular screening program, with approximately 2,900 having an asbestos-related disease. So some lessons learned from Libby. Registry can be useful for standardizing and aggregating data collected under various programs. In this case, there were multiple versions of the screening program over the years. Also, unambiguous exposures and unambiguous health outcomes strengthen the results and reports that come from a registry. Linking survey data with objective clinical measures may aid in answering stakeholder questions about health outcomes potentially related to exposure to hazardous substances. So in the overall conclusions from this presentation, first, registries are resource intensive and need to be carefully designed. We talked about the difference between a disease versus an exposure registry. We talked also about the considerations that should be made prior to implementing a registry. And finally, the purpose and intent of a registry guide all subsequent design decisions related to registries. Also, lessons can be learned from other environmental health registries. I know we have some large registry programs that we'll be presenting over the next couple days. The ones that I presented were the National Exposure Registry, National ALS Registry, and the Tremlite Asbestos Registry. Almost done. This is a slide showing some resources. The first one is a paper by Antau et al., Considerations Before Establishing an Environmental Health Registry. And in fact, I dipped into this paper quite a bit as I produced the slides for this presentation. The next one is the ATSDR EpiCase Toolkit. It contains a decision support tool designed to help policymakers think through the issues behind establishing a public health registry. And then finally, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ, has published a very nice 2-book set, Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes. That's a third type of registry that I didn't talk about, but the content of these books is very technical and would provide a good basis for any entity trying to set up an exposure or disease registry.